Chapter 1. The Rise of Henry VIII in the Land of England. There once rose a king whose name echoed across centuries as a ruler of strength, a figure of controversy, and a man driven by unshakable desires. And this king was Henry VIII, a monarch who would transform the destiny of an entire kingdom and reshape its spiritual identity forever. When Henry was young, he was not born to be the king, but fate shifted unexpectedly after the death of his elder brother Arthur, and the weight of the crown fell upon his shoulders, making him the chosen ruler of England. As he ascended the throne, he carried with him a vision to build a powerful realm and a desire to forge a legacy. Through a strong royal bloodline, Henry possessed charm, intelligence, and physical strength that impressed everyone who saw him, and his court admired him as a king crafted for greatness, with a heart filled with ambition and a mind ready to make bold decisions. Soon after becoming king, he married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a woman of dignity and faith who stood by him through years of triumph and struggle. Yet despite their long marriage, a shadow slowly began to grow in the heart of the young king, for Catherine was unable to give him a surviving son. And in the world of royal politics, a male heir was not only a blessing, but a necessity, for without a son, the kingdom risked chaos and civil war. And with each passing year, Henry's fear deepened that his legacy would crumble after his death. This fear soon turned into an obsession that would change the future of England. Henry began to believe that his marriage was cursed, and he convinced himself that God was denying him a son because he had married his brother's wife. This belief took hold of his heart, and he began searching for a way to end his marriage so that he could remarry and father a male heir. But the laws of the church were clear, and the Pope refused to grant him the annulment he demanded. This denial ignited a fire within Henry, and he felt the power of the church standing in the way of his destiny. The refusal pushed him toward a path that would soon shake the religious foundation of the nation. It was during this time that Henry's eyes fell upon a young woman in his court, Anne Boleyn, a woman of sharp mind, strong will, and captivating presence. She refused to become the king's mistress, and instead demanded something no woman had ever dared to request. She wanted to be his queen. This challenge, this resistance, and this rare spark of confidence awakened something powerful inside the king, and Henry became determined to marry her regardless of the cost. To achieve this, Henry made a decision that would echo through centuries. He chose to break away from the authority of the Pope and declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, giving him the freedom to decide his own marriage and reshape religious law. This act marked the dawn of the English Reformation, a transformation that altered the spiritual identity of the entire kingdom and forever tied Henry's personal desires to the fate of his nation. And with this new power in his hands, Henry finally annulled his marriage to Catherine and took Anne Boleyn as his new queen. But the path he had chosen had only begun, and ahead of him lay conflicts, betrayals, heartbreaks, and choices that would stain history with both greatness and tragedy. For Henry VIII was not just a king, he was a storm that reshaped England itself. Chapter 2. The king who could not find peace. King Henry now stood at the center of a storm he himself had created, and every corner of his palace whispered about his rising frustration, because he wanted a male heir who could secure the Tudor throne for the next generation. And yet no such child had survived, and this failure grew inside him like a shadow that followed him everywhere. And soon this shadow began to shape his decisions in powerful ways. And as months passed, the king started believing that his marriage to Queen Catherine was cursed, and he convinced himself that God had denied him a son because the marriage had violated divine law. And this belief pushed him toward a path that would shake the structure of England forever. And in the silent halls of the palace, people watched him grow more restless and more determined, because he thought that only a new wife could give him the future he desired. And during this time, his court was filled with political tension, as nobles whispered about the king's private struggles and the pressure he felt from foreign powers, and the fear that the Tudor line might collapse without a male successor. And Henry spent long nights in deep thought, questioning his choices and imagining a different world where a strong crown prince already existed. And this longing tormented him every day. And in those troubled hours, he turned his attention toward Anne Boleyn, a woman unlike anyone he had ever met before, because she carried a power that came not from title, but from presence and grace and intelligence. And as Henry watched her, he felt hope rising again, and he believed she might be the one to give him what destiny had denied, until now, and this belief grew stronger each day. And soon it consumed him entirely, because Henry convinced himself that England needed her, and without realizing, he was stepping into a decision that would challenge the greatest powers of Europe and test the limits of his own authority. And while the world outside remained unaware, the foundations of church and kingdom had already begun. Shake as the king prepared to rewrite the laws of faith for the sake of a throne that he feared might fall without a son. Chapter 3. The fall of Anne Boleyn and the birth of fear. King Henry now stood at the height of his power, yet inside his heart, a storm was rising for the king who once saw Anne Boleyn as the light of his destiny. Now began to see her as the shadow standing between him and the future. He wanted every court whisper became a blade of doubt for Henry, who had once challenged the church, and the world for her began to suspect betrayal. Where none existed, Anne tried to hold the king's trust, but fear had its claws deep in Henry's soul. He wanted a strong heir to secure his throne, yet the child he wished for had not arrived, and this single fact grew heavier in his restless mind. Each passing day, the royal court watched in silence as Anne struggled to survive in an environment that no longer welcomed her. Every smile felt forced, every step felt measured, as if the palace floors themselves judged her worth. Henry's advisors understood the king's shifting emotions, and some saw an opportunity to strengthen their own positions. They fed the king's worry with carefully shaped stories, saying that Anne had grown too ambitious, or that she spoke too freely, or that she encouraged enemies of the crown. Henry listened, for his mind was desperate for a reason to escape the emotional maze he had created around himself. Many claimed that Anne held dangerous influence over Henry, that she controlled his decisions. But the truth was far more tragic. Henry had grown tired and restless, and Anne had become a symbol of the battles he wished to forget. Soon the accusations began to rise one after another, all built on fragile ground, yet supported by the fear that ruled the palace. The charge of treason fell on Anne like a silent blade, cutting away the world she once knew. She was taken to the Tower of London, where its cold stone walls echoed with the cries of countless souls before her. But even there, she held a quiet strength, speaking with a calm that unsettled those who guarded her. Henry did not visit her, nor did he send words of comfort, for he had already allowed the conclusion in his heart. Long before the trial began, the court declared her guilty, and though many knew the accusations were empty, none dared to stand against the king's will. On the morning of her execution, Anne walked with a grace that stunned even her enemies. Her final words carried no anger, no bitterness, only a strange peace that made those around her question the truth of everything they had been told. With Anne gone, Henry believed the storm would pass, yet what settled over him was not relief, but a deeper silence. A truth began to take shape, a truth he refused to face, that the war he fought was not with the women he married, nor with the advisors who surrounded him, but with the fear inside him, the fear of death, the fear of losing his power, and the fear of leaving behind a kingdom without a lasting legacy. And so even as the chapter of Anne Boleyn closed, the shadows around Henry only grew darker, preparing the path for the choices he would make next, choices that would carve his name into history with iron certainty and relentless ambition. Chapter 4. The fall of a king and the price of his obsession. King Henry stands in the later years of his reign, his body heavy, his spirit burdened, and his heart filled with the weight of every decision he ever made in the name of power and legacy. And the son he believed he must have to secure England forever. And now, the court whispers that the unstoppable ruler has begun to slow down, and that every step he takes is haunted by the shadows of the queens he once loved, used, or destroyed. And he knows it too, because every room he enters feels colder than the last, and the great palace that once echoed with celebration now echoes with fear, as if the walls themselves remember his choices and judge him for them. And the king sits on his throne, wondering whether all his victories have finally turned into chains around his own soul. And the world outside watches a monarch who once broke his whole kingdom away from Rome, now struggled to break free from the consequences of his own nature. And every night the king feels Mary and Elizabeth drifting further from him, and he knows that their futures hang in the balance of his approval and the shifting alliances of his council. And he wonders whether they will remember him as a father or as a force they had to survive. And the king hears the people talk about his marriages more than his achievements, and he knows that this is a story he can never rewrite because it is carved into history with every oath he broke, and every heart he silenced, and every life he took in the pursuit of a son. And yet, even with all this, he still tells himself that he acted for the strength of England, and that the price of greatness is paid with sacrifices that history will one day understand. And he hopes that this belief is enough to keep the ghosts quiet for just one more night. And the king, now older and weaker, stares at his only son Edward and sees in him both triumph and tragedy, because the boy is sickly and frail, and every doctor whispers that his health flickers like a candle in a storm. And the king knows in his heart that perhaps the son he fought for so fiercely might not survive long enough to rule. And this thought cuts deeper than any sword. And for the first time he feels fear, a fear greater than battle or rebellion, because it is the fear that every sacrifice he made might have been for nothing. And as he looks back, he sees Catherine of Aragon, whose loyalty he cast aside, and he sees Anne Boleyn, whose ambition he admired until it frightened him, and he sees Jane Seymour, who gave him the heir he wanted, but lost her own life for it. And he sees the queens who followed, trapped in political games that revolved around his moods and desires. And he realizes that he was a storm that swept through their lives, leaving only fragments behind. And in the silence of his chamber, the king finally allows himself to wonder whether a ruler with absolute power can ever truly see the human cost of his choices, until it is far too late. And he remembers the days of youth when he was handsome, admired, and full of promise. And he wonders when that young prince turned into the man he sees in the mirror, now heavy with regret and aware that every triumph has a shadow, and every crown has a weight beyond gold. And in the last years of his reign, the king becomes increasingly isolated, the court divided by fear, ambition, and uncertainty. And every advisor watches him carefully, trying to predict his moods, because a wrong word can still mean death. And the king feels this distance, and yet refuses to admit that his once absolute authority is slowly slipping from his grasp. And he holds the memory of his power like a sword, even as the blade dulls with age and illness. And in the final chapter of his life, he signs documents with a trembling hand, and feels the truth pressing on his chest that the empire he built will soon pass into the hands of children and advisors who may never understand the full weight of his decisions. And as his strength fades, he begins to speak to the memory of his past queens, as if they stand beside him, and he asks questions that no one living can answer, because he wants to know whether they curse him or forgive him. And he hopes in some impossible way that history might show mercy, even if he never showed enough of it to others. And on his final night, the great king breathes slowly, and the room grows silent, because everyone knows that England is about to lose the most powerful, most feared, and most complicated ruler it has ever known. And as the last moments approach, Henry thinks not of wars or politics or royal authority, but only of legacy. And he wonders whether the story of his reign will be remembered as strength or as obsession, and whether the future kings and queens of England will learn from his triumphs or from his failures. And with his final breath, he understands at last the price of his hunger for a son, and he realizes that history will remember him not only as a mighty monarch, but as a man who tore kingdoms apart to fulfill a single desire. And then he closes his eyes, and the world moves forward without him, while the story of Henry VIII becomes a tale that echoes through centuries, reminding every ruler that power has a cost, and legacy is never what you expect it to be. Chapter 5. The final reckoning of King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII now stood at the end of a life shaped by power, fear, desire, and the endless pursuit of a male heir. His body had grown weak, his injuries never healed, his heart remained restless. Yet the kingdom he ruled was still trembling from the storms he created. The break from the Church of Rome, the rise of the English Church, the dissolution of monasteries, and the downfall of countless men and women were all part of the legacy he left behind. Henry spent his final years in a strange mixture of triumph and regret. He had achieved his greatest political ambition. England was under his absolute control. No foreign power, no religious authority, no council could challenge him. Yet the absence of inner peace followed him like a silent shadow. His marriages had become the story of Europe. 6 queens, 6 different fates, some tragic, some fortunate, some scarred forever. Catherine of Aragon lived her last days in sorrow, yet she never abandoned her loyalty to Henry. Anne Boleyn died with courage, still believing her name would one day be cleared. Jane Seymour became the mother of the long-awaited male heir, but lost her life immediately after. Anne of Cleves survived with dignity and wisdom, gaining Henry's friendship and escaping the fate that had claimed the others. Catherine Howard fell to the same blade that ended Anne Boleyn, her youth and innocence crushed by the brutal world of the Tudor court. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, guiding his children and shaping the future of the royal family. But Henry himself remained trapped inside a fortress built of his own choices. As his health declined, his moods grew darker. The leg wound that tormented him filled the palace with the smell of infection. The king who once commanded armies now struggled to walk. The royal physicians whispered of the danger. The council feared his temper more than ever. The people wondered what would happen when the king who changed their world finally closed his eyes. Henry spent long nights staring at the tapestries that decorated his chambers. They showed great victories, mighty kings, glorious hunts. Yet in those quiet moments, even he could feel the weight of everything he had done. He thought of his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both brilliant, both strong, both shaped by the storms he created. He thought of Edward, his precious son, the prince for whom kingdoms were broken and blood was spilled. Henry believed Edward would fulfill all the dreams he never could. A perfect male heir, a perfect legacy, a perfect future. But fate had other plans. As Henry approached his final breath, he asked for the sacrament, whispering that he placed his soul in God's hands. The room was filled with silence. The once unstoppable force of England lay still. At last, the reign of Henry VIII came to an end, but his impact did not end with him. His decisions shaped the destiny of England for centuries. His break with Rome created a new religious identity. His marriages changed the royal bloodline. His children Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward became rulers whose reigns were defined by the world Henry built through fire and iron. Some called him a tyrant, some called him a visionary, some called him a king driven by fear, but all agreed on one truth. No other ruler had ever changed England the way Henry VIII did. His life was a storm, his rule a battle between desire and duty, his legacy a mixture of greatness and destruction. And long after the crown left his head, the story of King Henry VIII continued to echo through the halls of history, shaping the nation that still remembers him today.